As a part of Granger, sometimes we would seek out ghost towns, and I went with my other friends on a few of these excursions that they would go on. Most of the time, you would find one that was relatively well known. Things are overgrown, but there were signs of squatters, campers, hunters, vandalism, etc. One time, we found out about a very small town that was abandoned in the 20s. After a ton of research, he loaded up supplies and planned a hike to see if he could find it. After several unsuccessful attempts on solo attempts, he brought me along. The hike started out at an old abandoned railroad junction that was in itself 5–10 miles off the road. We followed a rail line for about 5 miles. I kept diminishing as we went. Eventually, we got to a point where there was no longer any side of the railroad line, and we kept going. He was an experienced tiger and had planned where we wanted to go this time. After about 15 or so miles, we found it. The town itself was very small. It was there about 5 houses in a really small general store. Think about the size of a small convenience store. What was left over, the houses, were in a relatively decent condition, and a couple of them had been abandoned very quickly. Furniture and pictures left behind, clothes and other belongings packed but not taking. It was surreal. We found a letter that was dated 1922, which was about the time the town speculated to have been abandoned. The store had some product left on the shelves, but this was not like a store in the traditional sense, maybe more like a trading post. There were a few advertising signs and a few boxes of soap flakes and canned items that we couldn't make out. I guess the story was that the town was existed because it was on a rail line. There was a grain storage facility that was originally located a few miles away from the rail line. My uncle speculated that people in the town either owned and ran the grain facility, and the grain facility burned down and the rail line was diverted away. Thus, the little town died. Or it could have been at the rail line, diverted in the green facility, burned down later either way. Like I said, I've been to a few ghost towns before. This was like anything I've ever seen. Though the people that lived here were relatively well off, not rich necessarily, but this did not mean that they were having any troubles. This did not appear to be a farming community like you'd expect. Everything just looked frozen in time, and there were no roads anywhere nearby. The closest paved road was probably 30 miles away. It is possible that there were a bunch of handful people who saw this place since it was abandoned, and this place is in the middle of nowhere. My uncle found out about the town by seeing a reference to on a very, very old railroad map. I'm a park ranger, and I like to hunt. And when I say I hunt, I don't mean I sit in a tree stand. I mean I'm the guy out hunting by walking over the entire park with enough on my back to let me sleep at night, sort of comfortably, by little enough that I won't mind dragging 150 pounds of yummy out of the woods. All right, so I'm hunting a fairly large forest somewhere in the northeast corridor of the U.S. It's not uncommon to run into people on the edges of the woods. It's fairly uncommon to run into people in the middle of the woods, even during hunting season, unless you're on the trails, which I wasn't. And it's decently common to run into the ruins of buildings from the 1800s. I happened to be hunting a new valley that I was pretty sure had a crossing in it. To set the view, I'm sitting on top of a steep shale slide, looking down into a valley with a creek running through it. Approaching this plateau, there's a knife edge that runs up and down the ridge, but there's really no way to get up to that spot, except if you're seriously determined, drunk, or foolish. Getting up here creates quite a bit of noise from the stones sliding on the stones, which means I know I need to sit up for an hour to let things settle down before I made the descent. Since it's such a pain in the ass, I left my day pack at the bottom under a pine tree and only had a rifle, binoculars, water, and an energy bar. I'm up here for about 3 hours, glassing this little piss of a stream, looking for something to cross it, seeing nothing but squirrels and birds, and I finally decide to start glassing the opposite hill of sheer boredom. I am 90% sure I chose a poor spot and wasted an afternoon looking at nothing. Such as hunting, it's got really interesting days and it's got really boring days. And that's why it's called hunting and not shooting. As I'm screwing around with the focus of the binoculars, I catch a glimpse of something which almost looks like a person if they were wearing dark blue clothes and about 4 feet tall. 99% of the time, the day hiker just passed by without realizing I'm here, even with the blaze orange requirements. Or they pretend to ignore me, but you'd be amazed how many times someone has almost walked through my stand anyways. This person wasn't moving, which started to make me think I was wrong. It was just standing there, behind the cover of some low scrub brush and tree branches, and I would have missed it if it were not for the color. I zoom out a bit and realize that I'm not looking at a person, but it's actually a collapsed cabin. I was looking at where the door would be, except it really did look like a person, and cabins aren't blue. I move the zoom back to the door and play the focus for about 5 minutes, and I can't get the person to come back. In fact, the cabin door now has some light from the setting sun visible through the holes in the walls and roof. Whatever 4-foot-tall thing I was looking at has moved. Teenagers, right? I have that thought, and then realize something else. I still can hear birds and squirrels and all the other things in the woods, which typically would go quiet when they noticed something, which means that they didn't notice me, but that also means that they didn't notice whatever was in the cabin door short time ago. I'm doing my best to stay quiet and not move, and whatever it was certainly did move. I would expect everything in the woods to have gone for a cover with a teenager crashing to the brush. But the noises almost made it worse. There was stuff moving in the brush, but the problem was the stuff was moving around in the brush. I started to think that it was a trick of the light since the sun was setting. It was getting to that part of the day when trees don't look like deer. I knew would have to move soon and figured it might as well pack up because I still had to get down to the shell and get back to the pine tree where I planned to throw a tarp and sleep. At this time, I realized it was a dark per se, but it was overcast now. Again, the creepy experience isn't that. There's something obviously wrong, is that everything is so completely normal that I would expect that I was alone. About this time, a fog rolled into the valley, which the combination of overcast weather conditions, sunset, and a ground fog coming up into the wet low valley has signaled that it was time to leave. I checked my safety, put the caps on my glass, and reached up to take down my orange flag. The moment I grabbed the flag, the dread came. That's the only way to describe it. The woods went from animals going home to sleep to fool on you are fucked. The movement had attracted what I could only describe as 1,000 invisible eyes, which all turned in unison as they noticed me. Either ever wonder what a deer feels like in the headlights? This definitely has to be as, then I heard the children. I heard children laughing. Not teenagers, not adults, not women, but 4- and 5-year-old kids laughing like they caught a firefly. I hiked in 5 miles the previous day, through woods, and put down more today. When I woke up and got to the spot, and I distinctly hear children laughing during what I could only describe as the most creepy moment I've ever had in a valley. I know it's completely unoccupied, having stared at it for at least 4 hours or so. I am pretty sure my feet only touched the shell 3 times, getting down the knife's edge, and I made a ton of log noises doing it too. At this point, I didn't really care. I grabbed the pack of my flashlight and absolutely full-on fucking ran to the next hilltop. I killed my light halfway up the hill and then went to the top of the hill where I threw down the tarp and rolled my phone, and there I sat all night watching the hill I just came from. The scariest experience I had as a backcountry ranger in Washington state was being stalked by a cougar for a day and a half. I was hiking up an unpopular trail to an old shelter that had that creepy being washed feeling. I had seen fairly fresh cougar scratches and scats along the trail, but that's pretty common up here, so I wasn't worried at all that night I camped at the shelter, which only had 3 walls and a roof. I felt uneasy all night and hardly slept. At one point, chatting to myself for being paranoid, I raised my emergency foil tarp around my sleeping bag so I could at least hopefully hear something if it approached me as I slept. The next day, I found a fresh scat and brush off the trail. I was hiking on. About a mile past the shelter, I found a mostly eaten deer and some dense brush off the trail. Cougars often keep kill stashes throughout their territory for lighter snacking. Now, a cougar won't usually tangle with a human, but here I am, 5 feet tall, 100-pound sack of flesh and bones, and at least 13 miles out from many other humans. I decided to cut short my 3-day trip and hurt-footed it right back out of there. The last 2 hours of hiking through the dusk in dense forest was most hair-raising hike I've ever had. I didn't know if I was capable of being that hyper-vigilant. As a fuel botanist in Oregon pre-legalization, I always was told by other supervisors that if I had any time I should stumble upon black hoses in the woods, it was to immediately turn around, head back to the base, and let them know. Apparently, pot farmers use the hoses to pipe out water to their crops, hidden in the BLM or FWS land. I spent about 3 months on a wilderness excursion with a group called Knowles. For the first segment, we spent 2 weeks backpacking through the Gila National Forest. Now, to give you an idea how far into the backcountry we were, we carried all our food for about 6 or 7 days. We found our own water and wiped our asses with rocks. Got the idea? Good. So we were about 5 days into our first ration. We're meeting a pickup trucks to a remote George road the next day. It had to pretty much take a shortcut, so we wouldn't miss it. If we did, we'd have to wait another week for food, and we were already pretty low. We made the decision to cut through a section of private property in order to save a few days of travel to make it on our location on time. However, we weren't able to make it all the way through this property and still able to camp near water access. Well, we scoped the area out and found that there were a couple old rundown hunting shacks, but they mostly looked abandoned or just used during the hunting season. We found a nice grassy field to build camp in a soft bed under some pine nettles to set up. Our kitchen area, well, we've got a dinner on our camp stoves, tent set up, and sun is setting. And from the trees we see a hound bounding over a long-bearded, long-haired hermit dude screaming at us. If you've ever been out in the wild or lived in a rural area, there are 2 types of people you will find being hermits. 1, the kind they're absolutely insane and have spent the last 40 years eating the wrong kind of mushrooms and gun collections that would put a city armory to shame. Or 2, they are the kind of person who moved away from people in order to find inner peace and commune with nature. We were pretty on the bench, which this guy was. Well, as he comes running over shouting at us, "Who the hell are you, and what are you doing on my land?" not wanting to get shot or murdered in the middle of nowhere. We tried to calmly talk to him. "Oh, we didn't know we were trespassing. We were just passing through in a way up to ration meetup. We're so sorry. We can leave you one." "Well, how long you stayed for?" "He went back just for the night. We'll be gone first light in the morning." "Oh, well then, you can stay." Well, that went smoother than expected. Turns out he used to be a raging alcoholic and a motorcycle enthusiast. He got raped drunk at a bar one night, tried to ride his home on his bike, crashed somewhere along the way, and woke up 3 days later in a hospital. His BAC was over the lethal limit by no right, should he have lived through that. That day, his wife issued him an ultimatum: give up drinking forever or lose her and the kids. When he left the hospital, he found a real estate office, asked for the most remote plot of land available, and built a house there. All my friends were drunks, and I couldn't be around them. I had to move, and I didn't know anyone here, so I found me this plot of land, built a house, and now I make furniture out of Wispin. He invited us up to his workshop the next morning. I was just glad that when we woke up, no one was missing. Next day, he showed us up at the shop, introduced us to his lovely wife, and we said our goodbyes. We started saying goodbye with handshakes by the end of this. he was giving us bear hugs with tears in his eyes. And that's the story of Crazy Harold. About a year ago, I started dating someone who worked as a state park ranger who all called Jay. Jay lived on the state park property in a two-bedroom house tucked into the woods. We set the alarm and settled into bed around midnight with Jay's two dogs between us and a third dog created beside the bed. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep, so I lay down listening to the dogs snoring in the deafening silence surrounding us while Jay slept. And then it started. A repetitive bouncing sound of some sort was coming from outside the window, less than a few feet from where I was laying on the bed. As if someone were dribbling a basketball cement, the pace would speed up and slow down. The sound would become louder and softer. This continued for well over 2 hours. I wholeheartedly wanted to believe that I was hearing what were simply sounds of nature, so I ignored it. Next came the creaks in the walls. I know that houses make sounds, but this was unlike anything I have ever heard before. These sounds started in the hallway as very faint creaks. The creaks became louder as they reached Jay's bedroom, and what happened on the wall at the same time is going counterclockwise around the room until eventually it reached the wall beside me. The creak in the wall beside me was so loud that I jumped and the two dogs jolted from their sleep, and all the while I'm still hearing the bouncing ball outside the window and getting more nervous by the minute. And then at 3 a.m. I hear the most ungodly, terrifying growl shrieking from the center of the house. It was so loud that Jay flies off the bed, grabs a shotgun hanging on the wall. Jason from the bed and shout, "Is somebody in the house?" and takes off down the hallway towards the sound. The dogs are going berserk, and I'm in tears, absolutely beside myself, pleading with Jay that it was not a person. Jay comes back into the bedroom after not finding an intruder or anything of the sort, and says it must have been the dogs. I tell him it certainly was not the dogs, as I was awake the entire night. The dogs were asleep in the room with us. Maybe an animal got caught underneath the house. Yeah, maybe, I say. Somehow, after I've calmed down a bit, I drift off to sleep. The next thing I know, Jay is on top of me, with his hands around my throat and with the meanest look on his face, jerking my head back and forth, suffocating me and hurting me. I can't make any sound. I'm struggling to push Jay away, and that's when I wake up. It was all a vivid dream. Jay is asleep beside me. In the morning, we walk into the den and find a heater turned on full blast. It was the middle of summer. Jay only uses it during the winter months because the original furnace was quite tricky and it was pretty broken. I'm convinced something in that house did not want me there. That growl will forever haunt me. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on a great American road trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging through the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, pretty broke, and as my mom had been a long-haul trucker, I suggested that we save a ton of money and we should sleep in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut them up to make curtains. By the end of the first week, we had gotten this setup camp in about 10 minutes. We had our luggage moved to the front, curtains up, bedding laid down, and out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free camping sites, rest areas, and basically anywhere it seemed safe and semi-legal. There was never a night after the first night where we felt scared until the last week on the trip in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff, and I gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't go out on a set schedule and never worked or tried more than 3 or 4 hours a day. No destination really in mind, outside of a few must-see landmarks. We drive to places we found at night before on Google and take suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we met. We'd also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks and met a campsite. In the back of their pickup, because I got hungry and overheard them saying they were going to go. We met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out to drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar. We played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm, got fed breakfast and dinner by tons of campers who invited us to hang out with them, and spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was a positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite in Google and drove up into the woods following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town, and something seemed a little bit off when we pulled up to our campsite. There was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man opened the door. Taz waved hello. He just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. That as if he hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the door again, and staring at us through the window. I was figuring he just wanted some privacy, and he thought we'd be obnoxious. We pulled farther down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while there were still light out, we goofed around for a little bit, smoking and laughing and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Tess pointed out that a campfire farther down the campsite, and we decided to go be friendly. We'd met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks by just going up and offering beer or just chatting. So we wandered over. Near the campfire were 2 men, the owners of the cars we seen earlier. They seemed friendly, and we sat down and chatted with them. They were drinking and smoking, so we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed pretty off, and we came to find out that 2 of them didn't actually know one another. The older man was definitely on some sort of drugs. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFOs and however they seemed harmless. This left us chatting with the younger man who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting about our trip, families, and everything. Then he started talking about the bear. He'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Ted didn't believe him, and he pulled out his camera to show her some photos of the bear. It was very close to the campsite, and we both were a little freaked out. It wouldn't have hurt us for one of us to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around in the night spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laugh and for him to nudge Ted's with his elbow. Jokes on the foreigner, and they say, "The city girl, right?" He never did. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed as well and joked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved to another subject within 5 minutes. The ranger, I come back to it, and was talking about something grabbing us from our car in the middle of the night. No matter how we tried to steal the conversation away from serial killers, he kept latching back on. The older man was high as a kite at this point and was staring at the stars. Not talking, we just awkwardly laugh and sip our beer and try to get the conversation going somewhere else. Then, the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point, it was pitch black out, and I can't see anything outside the circle light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside the circle. Suddenly, there's a red dark in the darkness. And it took a moment for me to realize that it's a camera. The ranger's holding a camera. He had taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now, it wasn't very often people that we met to take pictures with us. My friend has his gorgeous dark hair, blue eyes with like a young Megan Fox, and we were pretty friendly. People like having pictures of themselves, too. It was an extremely strange thing to have this person taking pictures of us without asking or even indicating that that's what he was doing. We were both staring at him like deer headlights at this point. But instead of realizing what he was doing is a bit weird, he checks his camera, adjusts some things, and takes another photo, this time with the flash, not asking us to smile or proposing a group photo, and no explanation. After this photo, he comes back and sits down by the fire. Not a word said about the photo. At this point, me and Taz are mutually freaked out. We make some BS excuse that we need to go set up our campsite and nope the hell out. When we stand to leave, the UFO guy smiles and says, "Have a good night." Ranger, however, looks at us and smiles and doesn't reach to anything, and she just says, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair on the body stood on end. I wasn't alone in my discomfort either, because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rush back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV, and jump in the front seats. My friend Tez is all about hyperventilating. Why did he take pictures of us? I was shaking. I responded, "I read the serial killer sometimes warn their victims." She stared at me for a second and locked the car doors. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We both freak out. She's in full panic mode, turns on the headlights of the car, and I immediately yell her to turn them off because now he knows exactly where our car is. God knows why. But that's the only night we used not to set up our camp. We didn't need to tear anything down, so we just got out of there as soon as light came. As we got into the dirt road, the ranger was walking towards our car, and with that same cold expression. So I hope I never meet that ranger again. I'm a park ranger, but I'm mainly an environmental educator at a nature preserve. So I spend a lot of time outdoors in some isolated areas. There's one area of the park I try not to take groups of kids anymore. Once in a while, we have to go through that trail since it's a shortcut to the kayak launch. When it's 95 degrees outside, you ready for anything that'll make your trip a little bit shorter. When I started, one of the first things that I did was to familiarize myself with all the areas at the preserve. So I spent quite a bit of time hiking through all of the trails and even the rarely used ones, since I have to know my way around to navigate groups or go rescue someone if they get lost, which does happen. One part of the preserve is an old homestead site of a now abandoned pineapple plantation. It was settled in the 1890s. We don't know much about the family beyond the name and the approximate year they settled there, and the approximate year the homestead was abandoned. This is in southern Florida, and there are thousands of similarly abandoned homestead sites. The early settlers of the area had to be tough as snails. This was a pre-railroad area. The nearest town was about 5 miles south through what would have been wilderness in no real roads. So these guys were on their own in a land absolutely bursting with mosquitoes, panthers, bears, and bad water. Water table high is high fresh water, but can easily be contaminated by the salt water nearby. In other words, early homesteaders were badasses because that was the only way they survive. There's a narrow trail that is through what it was once called the homestead site. On one of my first days, I decided to trek through there. I got about a half-mile in when I started to get some weird vibes. I've always been sensitive to my surroundings and have spent enough time in isolated natural areas to know if something doesn't feel right. It probably means your instincts are picking up on something you should pay attention to. Usually this means your brain is picking up on minute movements on the ground and indicate an unfriendly snake that may be nearby or something else that you don't want to confront. So I stopped dead in my tracks and let my mind go quiet, looking around very carefully for warning signs. There weren't any. And I didn't see any recent tracks, but the bad vibe I was getting was still there. I shrugged it off and kept going to the trail, getting narrower, and the bad vibes getting deeper into my gut. I felt that it was being watched and followed. Now, this is an isolated area, so the possibility that a person was following me was remote, but possible. I stopped every few meters, but there were no sounds, actually none at all, not even birds. I started to sweat, and my heart started to race. One thought kept echoing in my mind. You are not welcome here. You are not welcome here. Turn around, you are not welcome. Well, fuck that. I thought just jittery from nervous new job feeling. I thought I came to abandon the trail and I stopped. My feet would go no further. In my mind, the phrase got louder. You're not welcome here. You are not welcome here. I heard a crash coming from behind me. When I turned around to investigate, there was no one. Not an animal. Not a human. Nothing. The vegetation was sparse enough that I would have been able to see something. I turned around and left. I put it down in nerves or me being a wimp or something and sort of forgot about it. About a month later, I'm taking a camp group through the kayak launch where the kayaks await us. I decide to take the groups through a narrow trail that saves us about 10 minutes. I get to the same bend of the trails, and the kids have gone silent. These are 9-year-olds in summer camp. They are not silent, and they're never silent. I look behind me to see that one kid who looks as though he is scared shitless. I don't like it here. He said, "Why not?" I asked. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I feel like we shouldn't be here." I couldn't turn around at that point, so we hustled to the kayak launch. And, as always, but we were all a little on edge. I took another group through their trail a week later, and again the kids were silent, and at that bed of the trail, for some reason, they just felt very unsafe. For that whole summer, whenever I cut that shortcut, kids would go silence and get those bad vibes. I try not to go down that stretch at all anymore, if I can help it. Obviously, this is nothing more than a gut feeling on my end, but only a few other times in my life, if I felt a gut feeling so absolutely strong, I don't know if it's a spirit or whatever. Homestead was there or something else, but it's hard to describe, but it definitely doesn't want people trespassing, that's for sure. I'm a park ranger, another ranger, and I were out on a search and rescue call once. The missing person was a man in his 20s. He had gone hiking and had not returned the day that he intended to. When we got the call, it was nighttime, but we hiked in a few miles and set up camp on a ridge that was a pretty good view. He had gone to the woods prepared, so we decided to wait until daylight before beginning the search. About 2 a.m., I get up and I'm taking a piss when I see a moving light at the base of the cliffs across the valley in a few miles away. It looks like a flashlight beam. I tell the other ranger, and we make decision to keep waiting for daylight. The next morning, we decide to go check out the area and bring this guy home. We get approximately to where I saw the light from the night before and start calling his name soon. We find his body at the base of the cliff. He had fallen 60 feet on his head. The body was badly mangled. We radio back that it was now become a recovery instead of a rescue. At this point, the other ranger yells and tells me to come look at this. Lying 20 feet from the man's body was his mag light. It seemed odd, but I thought nothing of it until the other ranger reminded me of the light the night before. It kind of gave me creeps, but I still dismissed it before too long. The coroner arrived and inspected the body. After he took the body back to the lab, he said that the man had been dead for at least 48 hours before we found the body. All of a sudden, the "oh shit" alarm went off my brain. I knew that it couldn't be possible. I have the coroner reviews work with the same results. I tried to find an explanation for the light that I had seen, perhaps the hikers, but one search and rescue guy had stayed at the trailhead in the entire night and no one had come or gone. To this day, I have no clue what I saw that night, but it freaked me out. The summer after I graduated, I spent a month working with a nonprofit that took inner-city high school teenagers aged 15 to 17 backpacking in a national forest for a week at a time. Most of these kids have never been hiking, much less backpacking. I had 2 girls on the second week say that they planned on not sweating because it is gross. I told them, good luck on that. Going into our last week out, my partner and I are feeling great. We were getting pretty sick of the food, but we knew what to expect from 20 teenagers at a time, and most of the students were really having a great and enjoyable time. The first day of the last week, my partner accidentally kept the van keys at the lead the guide needed, so we had to go down and meet them and give them back. While I stay with the 20 students, half an hour later, I get a radio message saying that I need to come to the group to the site immediately. I put my group student guide in charge and then tell them not to move from that spot for any reason. I ran all the way to the site and find a student laying on the ground next to a small lake. One of the guides puking in the water while trying to talk to the emergency satellite phone, and my partner conducting CPR on the student. While my partner was meeting one of the guys from the other group to exchange the keys, the students decided to go swimming. One of the boys panicked while swimming out to the rock and started drowning. The other students decided to leave without saying anything. Their other guide, an EMT, swam out to save him, but the student was panicking so much that he started climbing out on the guide and almost drowned him. That's when the guy was puking in the lake. EMT had to swim away. Then, another student that was recently certified. The lifeguard tried to save him, but was also pulled under and had to get away. By the time the lead guy returned, the drowning student was completely submerged and no longer responding. The lead guy swam out to him and pulled him out from the lake, but my partner ran back. He had heard screaming and shouting and knew there was a problem. He told a student to radio me. Right before I got there, his heart had recently resumed beating from CPR, and he started to breathe on his own. I monitored his breathing while talking to the emergency personnel. Once the emergency helicopter landed, I ran out to meet them and escorted them to the student. They hooked him up with an IV and carried him out. I ran back to my group and escorted them back to the bus pickup location without being able to tell them what happened. They were understandably upset for having their trip cut very short and having to sit in the same spot for 2 hours. I let them open all the boxes of cookies and whatever other food they wanted to eat and brought them for the whole trip. My team, my other 2 guides, my owner, and myself went back out a week later to recreate the timeline of events for the lawyer's insurance. On the way out of the forest, the owner of the company got 2 flat tires and 3 of us had to stay the night in a random motel, then rent a car out the next day to drive back to the city since we couldn't all fit in the tow truck. The student survived. He wound up staying in ICU for over a month in medical-induced coma to heal his lungs, but amazingly survived. I never saw him again, and we were not allowed to contact him. I hope he is okay. I am a seasonal ranger from my local forest district. Despite the fact that I live in a fairly suburban area, the forest preserves still make up 12% of the county, with much of the property being heavily wooded, not far out wilderness, but pretty secluded in some areas. Being a seasonal employee, I have been on the job for a bit over a month now, but in my short time there, I have found quite a few things. 1. A dead man in a tree. The rest of the rangers say they find out about 1 suicide a year, so there was the one for the year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in the clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops in the corner. Freaking corner took about an hour to show up, and he was only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So I stared at the dead guy in a tree for about an hour. 2. Crazed. Drugged up naked man running around a parking lot took me and 3 other rangers to catch the damn guy. When we finally caught him and found out he had multiple cuts across his body from running through brush and rocks lodged firmly up his ass. And 3. The headless deer. Normally, when a pack of coyotes takes down a deer. Yes, they have a bunch of coyotes around here. They leave bite marks all over the body, along with torn and flesh everywhere. But the head was cleanly sliced off and placed directly next to the body, meaning this is something created by human intervention. We still haven't figured out what that's about yet, and I've only been here for 5 weeks. My brother Jay was a part of the orienteering team in high school. It really helped him get ready for being a state park ranger. For those of you who don't know, orienteering is when they put you in the middle of nowhere and teams of two give you a map and a compass, and you must find your way to each check-in station in order, and it's a race. So, my brother and his partner set out, make it through the first few checkpoints, and are feeling pretty solid. But they don't make it to the next one when they think they're supposed to. They double-check the map, do some math, and figure out that they miscalculate some angle or another and are lost at the edge of the map. They recalculate and set off in a new direction. Keep in mind, this line was never intended to be part of the orienteering run. This is unexplored territory, and they came across what my brother said could only be described was a crater, a deep bowel in the forest, the void of trees. At the center of it was an ambulance. They were in the woods, miles upon miles from many roads, and there is an ambulance that looks like it's decades old, sitting in a crater. So being teenage boys, they go to investigate it. Fuck the race. My brother said that the forest was well on its way to reclaiming the vehicle, and that it was just rusted and covered in paint plant life. It looked out of date. Like it came from the 40s or some bygone era. In the back, the gurney was still there, but bent in the middle, like something had smashed it. There were brown smears on the walls. I could have been rust or dirt or blood. They both got a horrible feeling from the place and took off out of there. My brother thinks he could have probably find it again, but flat out refuses to. So who knows what happened in that crater in the middle of the woods in that ambulance. I am a wildlife biologist, informer, wildland firefighter. I wouldn't say anything too strange, but definitely some very interesting encounters. I used to work on one of the largest wildlife refuges in the country, right on the Mexican border. So I ran into border crossers all the time. Most of the time I would see them because they would flag me down because it was too hot and they were giving up, sometimes. I would just be thinking to trail cameras, and I would hear a bunch of rustling when 10 or so people scatter on directions. One time, I brought the SD from the trail cam at the very remote water hole back to the office to check. The first pictures I saw me installing the card were maybe 5 minutes later, a group of about 10 guys, all carrying 50 or so pound packs filled with weed and guns, come into the water. I'm sure they were just watching me, waiting for me to leave. And I knew this stuff happened a lot, and I know with lookouts and what it's probably happened to more than I know, but it was still kind of eerie. A similar thing happened on a trail, came in South Africa with a leopard I walked by. Body T, and he walked by the opposite direction, coming out from where I was walking. Towards about 1 minute later, he obviously heard me coming, stepped to the side in the bush, and waited for me to pass. With me, none the wiser. Another time in South Africa, I was half dozing off in the forest and heard something next to me. I was researching some mongo monkeys and at the time following a troop, so I figured it was one of them. I looked over and there was a honey badger about 3 feet from my face staring at me. I kind of made a quick small movement. He made a very surprised face and ran the opposite direction. I wouldn't say any of these are strange as much as cool, but they were interesting and pretty creepy at the time.